Let's understand the world a little better. I'm your host, Timon Wunderlich, and with me is Scott Santens, UBI advocate and author of Let There Be Money, Understanding Modern Monetary Theory and Basic Income. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Let me first ask you to dive in. What is universal basic income? What is your definition of it?
Yeah, basic income is defined as a periodic cash payment that is unconditionally delivered to all on an individual basis without means tests or work requirement. So essentially, there are 5 characteristics to a UBI. It's unconditional, universal, individually provided as cash um, to everybody.
Unconditionally. So I think that's
Yeah.
an important point. What do you think that should be implemented in the US? I think where you live, or do you think it should be implemented in the whole world? Do you think that's a generally good idea?
Yeah, I think it should be a foundational policy in every country.
And why do you think that is?
Because I think that countries end up expending a lot of resources unnecessarily on things that would be avoided if people just had the means and the security that a basic income provides. So, if you're looking at something like in undeveloped country, it would certainly be more difficult depending on the tax system, but it would be very beneficial and better than, say, subsidizing goods like oil and grains and stuff, and just making sure that people instead have the ability to purchase those goods in markets. And when you're looking at something like a more developed country, something that even has like a universal healthcare system, basic income would actually reduce the resources put into the healthcare system because the healthcare system ends up treating to such a degree the lack of basic economic security. It treats a lot of poverty, it treats a lot of inequality and insecurity, and kind of the impacts of chronic stress. And if you just made sure that people had this foundation under them, then the resources put into the universal healthcare system would go further and you wouldn't require as many. Same thing with education too. Like education is certainly something that every country needs to have as well. And so many students that go through the educational system, they may have poor outcomes, like outcomes that wouldn't be that are worse than if we had a basic income in place. Because say, if a student goes to school, they're hungry, they're not going to be able to focus on their studies, and if their household is full of stress, their parents are just busy constantly trying to get by, can't really help them with their homework, then you see reduced educational outcomes. So like let's say in a non-UBI system, let's say the average kind of outcome is essentially like a C. But if you had a basic income, then the average would be more like a B plus or B minus or B or something like that. You would see better outcomes on average with all these students going through the system.
Interesting. So the idea is also that it therefore self finances itself in a way.
To a large degree, yeah, it's very interesting to consider just to what degree that is, and there's certainly a lot of variance depending on the country of implementation, the context of that economy, the amount of the UBI, the design of the taxes and things. But in general, I think that we would expect to see savings in the form of reduced healthcare expensive and better educational outcomes, and even increased economic growth, higher productivity. These things.
Interesting. Also, increased economic growth. Why is that?
Yeah. So this is for a couple things. First of all, you have something called the multiplier effect. So this is, again, it depends on the amount of inequality in the country. In a high inequality situation, GDP growth is actually being pushed down by the fact that basically only the richest are purchasing, and a lot of the rest of the economy is left behind. So if there's various measurements in the U.S. a dollar spent on, let's say, an additional bonus to high income earners in the top 1% uh, adds 39 cents to the economy. And if you provide that same dollar instead to someone earning minimum wage down in the bottom quintile, then the impact of on economic growth is about three times that, about $1.30. So you also see that kind of impact in a lot of other places where there's a testing of unconditional cash transfers and similar programs like child allowances. So as another example, like in Canada, every dollar spent on their child benefit actually results in $2 to GDP. So it's just a dollar at the bottom. You can imagine how it just is spent, like a lot. Like someone goes to the store, that becomes someone's wages, and that person spends it, and then that gets just spent and spent and spent, and it causes or catalyzes all these economic transactions. Whereas if someone at the top has this dollar, it's kind of basically just sitting there. So you can see a lot more economic growth, a lot more economic activity by making sure that more people in the economy have a greater ability to actually express demand.
So it also benefits the people at the top in the end.
Right. It all still ends up going to the top, which again, where you want taxes to be in place, and it starts back at the bottom again, and you're constant this virtuous cycle of economic activity. And I would also add too that we also see a lot of increased entrepreneurship, which is another impact of
I can
this.
imagine.
So in this can actually be quite large and impressive. And in Namibia, their UBI pilot, entrepreneurship quadrupled, and in the India UBI pilot, treatment villages had triple the entrepreneurship of control villages. And those were in these in particular economies, let's say, where it was essentially kind of capital deprived. Like there's a would-be entrepreneur, but they have no access to capital, so they can't start a business. And even if they were get a microloan, they could start a business, but then who are their customers? So in an example of like the Namibia UBI villages, um, there was actually, this is a real example where a woman went out with her first payment and used it to buy flour and yeast and created a makeshift oven and started making these little miniature loaves of bread and as her new business. And because everyone else in the village had money to spend via their own basic incomes, then that ended up being a very successful business. So just imagine in the economy at large, how many businesses have failed not because they weren't providing like a product that people wanted, but just because maybe their customers lacked the ability or lost the ability in order to afford that discretionary income to purchase that stuff. So I would expect in a UBI economy there'd just be a lot more entrepreneurship. There'd be more competition between businesses competing over those customers, and yeah, there'd just be more economic activity in general.
That's actually a really interesting point. I wanted to come to that later on, because I thought about this beforehand. Obviously, before this podcast, I live in Germany, where we have Hartz IV, so that's something different than the UBI, but it's a social welfare system. And I actually know a few people, elderly people, who are benefiting or who are on that system, and some of these also have used that income to start side hustles or to try to get out of this social welfare program by starting something on their own. And but I often or sometimes, and no, these are just my own experiences, saw the problem that people started a side hustle that doesn't necessarily bring enough value to others as that they then can live off of it, because obviously if you provide values to others, people will give you value back, or that's at least the idea, or perceived value to at least. And that there's, just because people are active or are not doing nothing when they get provided a universal basic income, it doesn't mean that they are providing value to others, right?
Yeah, true. That's true in a world without basic income as well, and it's also true on the flip side of that. There's so much unpaid labor that is going on that's actually very valuable to society that is entirely unrecognized and goes without compensation. So when it comes to a basic income, I think one of the important components of that is that it does essentially recognize all the unpaid labor, and especially care work, mostly done by women, in a way that that enables it and recognizes it. So it's just kind of interesting how, let's say, the economy can recognize the work of two paid care workers watching each other's kids. But then, if they were to watch their own kids, then the economy would shrink and people would consider them not to be doing anything. So the idea in general that paid work is somehow better than unpaid work is false, that there's a lot of volunteering and stuff that's actually quite good. And then it's also a case that, yeah, there's a lot of paid work going on that isn't necessarily valuable and can even be damaging to society. And I think that's one of the important aspects of basic income too, is it gives people more power to actually make that choice. Like they can actually choose, do I want to pursue unpaid work, or do I want to pursue this job I currently have that I feel maybe is damaging or maybe isn't really contributing anything? And maybe I can do something else I feel is more valuable and contributes more to society. And maybe that new job actually pays a little bit less, but like they're in their current job right now because they need that, it needs to pay enough for them to do it. So it can actually subsidize this work that doesn't pay as much, that should pay more, that is very valuable to society. And yeah, in general, there's always going to be economic activity that maybe doesn't quite work out. There's all sorts of businesses that people start that fail, but I think in general, it's better to make sure that people have the capital and the ability to take that risk without fearing what happens if they fail, and also the ability for customers to be able to express their support for these businesses.
That's really interesting. I really like that idea that I mean I don't know. Did you have made research on this? If people actually choose or maybe choose less well compensated jobs for jobs that are that they themselves see as maybe more ethical.
I haven't seen a whole lot of like studies or something looking at this. I just think it makes a lot of sense, and there are kind of hints in the experiments that we've seen. So, as some examples of this, there's all sorts of studies, of course, that look at the impact on work of basic income. That's like one of the key concerns that people have is, oh, will people stop working? Will people work less if they have a basic income? And basically, across all these studies, in general, it does not have that impact overall and can often actually have an increase on work overall. But there are certain people that do respond to basic income in larger ways when it comes to paid work. Two examples of that are students and new mothers. So if you're a high school student, let's say, and you start receiving basic income, then a lot of students maybe are in the labor market because their households don't have enough income, so they're actually have dropped out of school to pursue paid work to help the family get by. And what we have observed repeatedly is that these students can actually drop out of the labor market and then go back to work. I mean, back to school and finish their studies and go on to pursue higher education. Um, this impact was so large in the Canadian Mincome experiment in Dauphin that uh, that at one point the graduation rates exceeded 100% in high school. And that was only possible because you had all these people that had dropped out previously that came back to actually finish. So the question there is, is that bad for society for people to quit their jobs and go to school to increase their educations? And clearly that's an investment that we know is very valuable to society and leads to even higher paying jobs and better for the economy. And the other example being new mothers. So this is especially true in the U.S., where we don't have any kind of real maternity leave policy. Some businesses might, but at the federal level, we have no maternity leave policy. So in in these kinds of areas, if a woman has a child and is currently employed and there is no ability to do that, then they use the basic income to effectively create a paid maternity leave for them. Like they're able to have that money and focus on being a good mother to their infants. And there again, is that not work? Like, is it bad for society to quit a job in order to be a parent, especially during those very early months of a child's life? Again, that's like an investment that pays quite well in return on investment down the road, in health and higher economic outcomes and all of that. So, like, those are two examples of people who like can work less, but then if you look at it in a different way, then clearly it's actually good. But overall, um, you actually see a lot of people actually work more, and so this can be like in the Stockton pilot. This was observed where recipients of the basic income found full time employment at twice the rate of those in the control group. And kind of an example of how this can be is one of the participants described how they were working like a part time job, and because of that basic income, which was only $500 per month, but because of that basic income, they felt they could afford to miss that day of work to actually go to this interview and apply for this full time job, which they were able to get. And so, in that way, we can consider that there's a lot of jobs that people would prefer that would be better matches, that they essentially can't afford to take the risk of losing whatever they have right now in order to pursue that job that they feel is a better fit.
You talked a lot about these pilots. How did these or some of these actually look like? So they took, for example, a little part of a or region of a city, and then um, everybody in that part of the town received universal basic income, so some 500 ish uh, uh, in income in that region, or higher or lower, or could you maybe give an example for of one of these studies?
Yeah, there's a lot of variance in the way that these pilots are designed, and like I prefer saturation pilots, and a saturation pilot being this kind of more universal pilot, where you do take, let's say, an entire village, and provide them all with a basic income. I feel that that really gets at some bigger impacts that kind of aren't observed in more kind of non-universal, non-saturation site settings. As an example of this, like as a kind of a saturation site observation, is you see a lot of reduced crime. In the Namibia pilot, crime was reduced by 42%, and in the Canadian saturation pilot in Dauphin, that was reduced by 37%. And when I say saturation in Dauphin, that was the entire town of Dauphin. That was, I believe, the population was like around 4 to 5,000 people. The Namibia pilot, that was a village of 1,000. The India UBI pilots were multiple villages, and altogether thousands of people. And again, those were full village wide. Stockton was more of a targeted program by income. So it's not like they looked at everyone in Stockton or anything like that. It was really just selecting 125 people that I believe they were earning under the median income in that area, and just provided them unconditional cash of $500 per month for 2 years, a little over 2 years.
In any of these, or after any of these studies, did they actually implement it at somewhere? universal basic income for a longer
No,
time?
no, it's been implemented nowhere after a pilot. Like a lot of these pilots are just experiments and trials, usually via philanthropic dollars. Maybe kind of local government gets involved, but nowhere has a government, especially at the national level, decided to go ahead with this. Um, the closest anywhere I like to point out is the annual Alaska dividend. That actually qualifies as a basic income because it meets all the characteristics. It goes to everyone in Alaska every year, regardless of income levels, no work requirements, and it's an annual cash distribution to every single person in a household. In fact, in Alaska, the amount for kids and adults is the same, whereas on a lot of basic income pilots, kids usually receive like half the adult amount or a third or something. Um, so that's the closest, and it's been operating since 1982. And it's not like they tested it first, because they didn't. At no point have they seen it as a basic income, and people don't really think of it as a basic income. It just is one because it meets all the characteristics, and it's very effective. And there's all sorts of impacts that have been observed from that too. Like for example, there's been a study on the work impacts of the Alaska dividend, and it turns out that it has increased part-time employment by 17%, and there's been no positive or negative impact on full-time employment.
But nowhere else it has been implemented.
No.
Um, why is that? So what are the counter arguments in a way? Then I mean, there seems to be a reason why people are not hopping on the train.
Yeah, that's the real question. Like what is it that really prevents uh especially lawmakers in positions of power to consider this? And I think an answer to that, it goes to the response that I've seen from particular people in power when it comes to these kinds of decisions. And so, if you go back to the 1970s, when Nixon proposed a basic income guarantee for families in 1969, and this it went through the House of Representatives and was passed there twice, uh, to the Senate, and then the Senate needed to pass it. And if the Senate had passed it, then Nixon would have signed it into law, and we would have had a basic income guarantee for families back in 1970 or 1971, depending. And the chair of the Senate Finance Committee um, said or asked the question, "Who will iron my shirts?" with a basic income. If people had this unconditional cash, then couldn't they say no to, what is essentially accepting cheap labor? The excuse is that they'll stop working entirely. But of course, really, if you anytime you want someone to do a job, all you have to do is pay them enough. So it's really in a matter of who will work for me cheaply, not who will work for me at all. And I think that's kind of where a lot of this comes from. Is it definitely impacts the existing power structure. There where a lot of these politicians have actually gained power within. Like if you're used to the existing system, you don't want to rock the boat, because then you may actually not benefit from that, from the new status quo. It's very much like a greater distribution of power, I would say. It's putting more decision making ability, more power and freedom in individuals' hands in an entire country. And there's a certain concern of what will happen.
Interesting, but with automation and with globalization, um, isn't there now a new opportunity for UBI then?
Oh, absolutely. But still, you still have all those people that will benefit from AI in a way that they'll get richer.
No, of course, but what I mean
AI
is,
is an inequality generating machine, is what and so if you are someone who looks at that and sees kind of dollar signs, then you may not want even to, what is it, to share the benefits of AI, more equally. Like, of course, that should be shared more equally. Like, we should see this as a dividend where, we essentially all trained the AI together through the content and information and stuff we produced, both current generations and previous generations. Um, and we should want this machinery, this technology to essentially work for all of us. But there are still people that would not want that. Like, you can never have too many billions, right?
Of course, but what I meant is the cheap labor you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Um, Now that can be now done by maybe a robot, for example, who cleans your shirts then, or if it's about labor that somebody writing you an email, so you have a personal assistant, you can maybe get that. Not that that is morally better, maybe, but you can get it overseas through via globalization. So isn't that argument not? Does it still work? The cheap
Well,
labor argument.
I mean, yeah, the concern there, is first of all, like, I do want machines to actually be doing this work. Like, if someone says who will clean the toilets, then the answer is, well, like, a self cleaning toilet would be great, or like toilet cleaning robots. Those are nice. Like, if we can actually create machines to do that, then great. Then a question, of course, is what happens to the people's incomes who were doing those things. And so that question becomes, like, does the person who is asking the question of who will clean my toilet, do they care what happens once they're no longer paying that person? And are they also concerned about the ability of that person to then demand a higher wage, elsewhere?
Hmm. No, okay, I understand. When was this discussion with Nixon? In what year?
Yes, he proposed this in 1969, and yeah, it passed the House, installed in the Senate in 70 and 71.
And since then, there was no other case in the U.S. at least where it was brought upon.
No, well, not really. That was the closest that it came, and there were a series of pilots across the country in the 70s. And there was pilots in New Jersey and Seattle, Denver, um, Gary, Indiana, rural North Carolina. There were lots of different things that we learned during that time. And then politically speaking, there was what was his name? I'm not remembering, but gosh, yeah, there was someone after Nixon later in the 70s that proposed a demo grant model of $1,000 per household. This has been like per year to like back in the 70s, and yeah, I mean, he didn't win clearly, but that was a policy proposal that, was there in the 70s. I would say nothing really came up through the 80s, um, and until like it kind of went off the radar until Andrew Yang ran, and then kind
Hmm.
of brought it back.
And in the future, do you see a trend where it might come back, or where it actually this time will get passed?
I think the pressure will only continue to build with the advances of AI. Like, I don't think that we'll see the same kind of thing where it'll just disappear again. I do think that you'll just kind of see more and more pressure because we'll just be seeing this increased inequality and increased precarity as a result of AI and the disruption that I think that it'll have on the labor market.
Um, I don't know if you heard about it, but in Germany is also another thing that's currently being discussed. That is a universal inheritance, I would call it. Um, did you hear about it? The idea is, I think, not at 19 years old or 20 years old, everybody gets $10,000 from the state.
I'm not familiar with Germany, but I am familiar with that in general. Like, it's a policy proposal here in the U.S. too. We call it baby bonds. As far as there being some kind of capital allocation at the the age of adulthood, That too actually goes all the way back to Thomas Paine, where that was what his recommendation was, is that, this was the late 1700s, and he said everyone at the age of 21 should start with this amount of income to start them off in life, and it would be paid for. He wanted to pay for it with inheritance tax, but his argument, like his higher argument in agrarian justice, is actually, I think, to this day, a great argument for basic income. And yeah, as far as like comparing these two proposals, um, I like the idea of these capital grants. I don't see them as kind of alternatives. I think that, everyone needs this lifelong economic security. We all have basic needs on a monthly basis, but getting infusions of like a lump sum are also very helpful, and can really help people get off on the right foot. In fact, there was actually some results that just came out this week, that are the first results of the largest and longest UBI pilot, which has been taking place in Kenya for the past 7 years, where they're doing a 12-year UBI pilot across like hundreds of villages and thousands of people. And they did three cohorts, and so they looked at a cohort that received a monthly income for 2 years, and there was another cohort that received that same total amount of money as the 2 year group, but they got it all at once right at the beginning as a
Hmm.
lump sum. And then there was the 12-year UBI group where they were getting the same amount as the 2 year monthly, but they knew that they were getting it for the next 12 years, and that will continue going on for the next 5 years. And really interestingly, the lump sum led to greater entrepreneurship effects than the monthly income in the 2 year group, and a lot of kind of better observations overall, except for the monthly group was less stressed, and but the really interesting to see just how useful that lump sum was. However, when you compare to the 12-year group, um, the 12-year group, they're actually able to voluntarily kind of self-organize lump sums through the monthly income by creating these kind of like they're called roscas, but they're these like kind of like group kind of wheels where everyone puts in, let's say a group of 20 people puts in an amount every month, and then each of those people like alternates, so that 1 month they get the entire amount, and then the next month another person gets the entire amount, and then the next month everyone gets the entire amount. So really interestingly, the long-term UBI is enabling people to choose to do these lump sums, and therefore seeing like the same positive impacts that are from the lump sums. But at the same time, because it's monthly and life and very long term, then people are seeing, very um, great reductions in stress and improvements across all these other measures.
And the entrepreneurship increase, that was still more so in the lump sum one than in the 12-year one.
The lump sum and 12-year were more similar than the 12-year and the 2 year when it comes to entrepreneurship.
Okay. So, in general, your opinion, you think universal basic income, if you had to choose between the two, um, is the better option.
Absolutely. It's
Okay.
just I see it as a foundational policy that other policies should exist on top of. And I think when it comes to something like a capital grant, baby bond, these kinds of things, that's something to consider as an additional policy that can actually help people more. But what you don't want to do is withhold this monthly security, just provide someone a huge lump sum and then be like, good luck, and ignore all the negative impacts that could have been avoided with this monthly security.
Now, I would assume in these groups, in these test groups, there were also some people who weren't able to give the value back in a way by contributing in through some other work, through entrepreneurship or anything. Did the people who created more value than they did before, and then they received, did they compensate for them?
Uh, I'm not quite sure what you're asking because I think it's also really hard to measure that. Like you could again, like if someone has takes that basic income and again maybe they quit their job and they do unpaid work, or maybe they just decide to do this. There's no measurement for what are they giving back or something. Instead, I
Oh,
would look just like kind of overall. That's what I think matters, is just like what is the impact overall on society, on the economy of people having this. And just in general, you see just a lot more uh, business startups and a lot more economic activity and a heightened ability to focus on what matters.
I guess my question was on the ROI, on the return on investment in a way. If you can think if it is possible to think through that problem in that sense. I mean, you just said unpaid labor then would not be counted. So that is a fair argument. But still, as you said, the number one argument against UBI, as I understood you, at least, was that people fear that others would be demotivated by that. And not contribute as much. And I also do think that in general, people want to do something. So even if they have enough money, let's say, they would generally be active, but that doesn't mean that they are necessarily if paid or unpaid helping their society. So for example, some artists may paint pictures but just for themselves, so that's obviously not a bad activity, but it's not helping necessarily others. At least
Yeah, but
if you would give the
it's
pictures
interesting.
back, maybe it's something different.
Yeah, no, it's so I've written about this before. I call it like the Quentin Tarantino argument for basic income, which is this question of kind of looking at Quentin Tarantino. Imagine that he was like in a basic income pilot, and he spent his much of his childhood and youth like just watching movies. Like that was he just loves watching movies.
Yeah.
And so if someone like looking at that just portion of his life, they're like, that guy is so lazy. Like, what is he doing? He's contributing nothing to society. And then later on, he becomes like an incredible filmmaker, and it's formed by all that time that he spent watching movies. So I think that's important to consider is even when we look at like an economic or an activity of any kind, and we consider it as being somehow useless, we never know at what point that is not the case. You could be a professional gamer after playing video games for a long time, and then at that point of being like this professional esports player, then everyone's like, oh, how great, he's contributing to society, he's earning millions of dollars, like people love what he's doing, he's super good at it, or she. And what is that like when it comes to the actual playing, beforehand, it's useless considered to be. So I think it has to take like a wider look at the fact that we can't really measure what is like useful to society and useless to society until we've looked at it, a much longer time span. Like, look at a person when they're, 90 years old or something and just about to die or have already died or whatever, and then you look at their entire life, and perhaps that's a more fair measurement to kind of like look at that point. But then taking a 2-year slice and judging people based on that, I don't think is a fair way of measuring their
That's fair.
contribution.
Looking more at the long term investment in a way. Still, I would say, I mean, Quentin Tarantino and all. I forgot what the other example was you mentioned. Those are exceptions, aren't they not? I mean, not everybody can be this great director, even if everybody would have the skills. I don't think everybody could be contributing in that way because people would choose at some point. If you
Sure.
understand.
Yeah. just like, if someone wants to be a well-known YouTuber or something, then the step one is you've got to actually create those videos, and you have to have time to create those videos, and maybe it'll end up being successful, and maybe you won't. But I do think it's important that someone who wants to do that should have a better ability to do that, and if it doesn't work out, they can always go on to something else. Um, and I think that that doesn't hurt society, and in fact could increase wages too. And this is also something that's observed, where if there's fewer willing workers to do wage work. This is actually these are from the 12-year pilot findings too, are that so many people actually pulled out of the labor market and started their own businesses, that the available labor for wage labor shrunk, and then those businesses had to increase their wages to make these jobs more attractive. And so I think that's a good outcome too. Like, if someone decides to just play video games or doing whatever, like, not only is that not hurting me and could end up being viable to society, through being a successful YouTuber or whatever, but it also would technically drive up wages if more people did that. And that also would make automation more attractive too, because that's another impact of when wage labor gets more expensive.
Mm. I still find it hard. I understand the argument though. And I also I thought about it in when think of a football player, for example, if he would get financed to train, and you don't know if he will be ending up in the NFL, but it
Right.
might not be solely about that one football player, but if you finance 500 of them or all of them, some will at least provide great value in the end. So that may be compensating that, like an angel investor in some sort. So
Yeah.
you're investing in a lot of companies, and most will fail, but one will maybe
Yeah.
uh, compensate for the others.
That reminds me of a story too, that ties right into this. Is that it was like on a radio show I was listening. This minor league baseball player was talking about how they had to quit the minor leagues. They never made it to the major leagues, just because they couldn't afford it. Like, the pay was too low to actually really go through life any longer. Earning that low wages and never knowing if you're going to make it to the majors or not. And the question is, maybe he could have made it to the majors. We don't know. We just know he was in a position where he just couldn't afford to do that anymore. And I feel it's tragic. Like, maybe, who knows where he would have gone, but I just hate how just the lack of economic security essentially made that decision for him.
Mm. Yeah.
There's something else I want to just mention too, because I feel it's important to understanding this kind of impact on work that so many people are concerned about. They'll listen to all the evidence in the world, and they'll say, well, sure, that was there, but would it actually work for real and long term, and whatnot? And so the thing about basic income is that it is not withdrawn as you earn additional income. And that's not true with any kind of existing welfare benefit that's targeted to those with a sufficiently low income or something. And this is kind of easier to understand with, say, unemployment income. You get unemployment income because you're unemployed, and let's say the income is $10,000 a year, like some low amount. And then if that person who is seeking employment gets a job offer, and the job is pays $10,000 a year, then they would go from receiving 10,000 to getting 10,000, in which case they would be no better off accepting the job. And so why would you do it unless you really want to do the job? Another, like, an economic way of looking at that is saying that that's a 100% marginal tax rate, um, because of the fact that they're no better off with this job. Basic income is different because it's this floor. So you start at $10,000 per year, let's say, and then a job offers you $10,000 a year, and now you're at $20,000 per year before taxes. And so you're better off accepting that job. And a way of looking at that, as far as marginal tax rates go, is that it could effectively be a 0% marginal tax rate, depending on your tax regime, in which case you aren't punished at all with a basic income. And so
Yeah.
once you understand that difference, then you don't even really need the data to understand that it just makes more sense with a basic income to accept a job. There's less of a work disincentive with that system versus the existing system where you can actually be very little better off or worse off by accepting a job.
Yeah, I want to tell you also a story because it goes into the same direction. Just in Germany, I actually come from a low income family myself, where from one side, one part of my family also had to at some point accept unemployment payments or social welfare. And what happens is if you're underage and your parents actually get these payments, then you also fall into that category. So your payments no longer receive child payments. I don't know what that's called in the US. I'm sorry. You get a payment. Not usually, if you have children, you get paid. I think $200. So that gets subtracted, but you get additional income for your child. But so now it's a case if I was to work, or I actually wanted to work when I was younger, when I was underage, that would actually be the income that I would
Right,
receive would actually be subtracted from that from that payment that my mother would receive. So
right.
I could work, yes, but then my mother would have less money, and that doesn't really like that. That's not an incentive for young
Right. That
children
is
to
that's a
do
strong work
something.
disincentive. Yeah.
Which it's actually the reason why I then stopped working as I found this out. Because
Yeah.
at first my mom said, no, it's great when you're working and everything, and you should be doing that. But I mean, I saw the difference when you're in low income family. These few $100 make a difference, or
Yeah. In
euros
that
make a
case, it
difference. And
was like your mom was paying you
yeah,
because it was coming from her income. And like, yeah, like
I don't want this. That's
right. Like I want my employer to pay me.
yeah, and I find that absolutely crazy how that is still a thing, and the government because there's I don't know the exact data, I don't know the exact facts, but I know that a lot of people who come from low income families in Germany who are under social welfare, their children actually also will later on become you will be using social welfare programs. And I think, or I can I could explain that to me for one argument. I think would be that they don't you're not getting you don't learn that work is important in a way, or that you don't receive the benefits from work in a way also.
Right. Yeah. Work should always benefit you, and you should actually be in a position where you can refuse a job that doesn't pay you enough. Like there's so many people taking jobs just because they need to survive, and because of that, those jobs can have horrible conditions. They can have abusive employers. They can have you could just be just a terrible job in general. Um, and it changes if like you actually have this bargaining power to say no, I'm not going to take that job unless it pays enough, unless the conditions are good enough, unless you treat me well enough. So it's a big deal to lack that power and and to gain that power.
Yeah. Well, Scott, thank you very much. If before we go over to our second segment, so some rapid fire questions, is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't, or anything else you want to add?
uh, I mean, we really covered a lot of the work stuff, and we only kind of touched upon the cost stuff, and we really didn't say anything about inflation stuff. And those are kind of the main concerns. So maybe you might want to talk a little bit more about the cost and the inflation stuff if you want.
Of course, that's why I'm asking the question. So,
Yeah. Okay.
inflation, I would have just assumed that if when inflation goes up, the universal basic income would also go up, so that it would be adjusted, or not?
Yeah, I mean that's a it's a simple way of making sure that the basic income keeps up with the cost of living by just adjusting for inflation. Yeah, and that's even how Social Security works in the U.S. But still, people fear that you could have like this runaway inflation where you have to keep cranking up the amount, at an ever increasing rate, and then people fear this hyperinflation and stuff, and like that's at least in the U.S. Maybe in Germany, you don't necessarily have that concern. But just to say a couple things about that, like first of all, and this is ties to the cost argument too, is that people people think that because everybody gets a basic income, then the cost of basic income is the amount of the UBI multiplied by the number of people, and therefore that's the cost. It's a very simple napkin math kind of estimate, but that's not the cost of basic income because you have taxes involved too. And when you have taxes involved, then you have people who are essentially paying for their own basic income. In which case, you imagine, depending on the crossover point of taxes and UBI, if the amount of UBI is $12,000 per year, let's say, then somebody's taxes as a result of UBI, additional taxes could be $12,000. In which case, they're no better or worse off than they were prior to UBI, and the government is not really spending anything on them. They're at net zero. So then, above that point, beyond that point in income, then people are paying more in new taxes than they're receiving in basic income, in which case they don't have any cost. And then if you look at people who are, let's say, paying, $6,000 to get $12,000, then what they're really getting is $6,000. And so you have to actually figure out that net benefit, and that's what the cost of a basic income is. And a lot of people don't kind of recognize that at the surface level. It kind of You have to dig a little bit deeper in to see that the cost of a UBI is the net cost, not the gross cost.
Hmm.
So depending on the tax taxes chosen and the reforms in the existing system. So, like, as an example, you don't necessarily have to raise taxes. You could say drop tax subsidies instead of raising taxes, in which case you would have fewer tax expenditures and basic income instead of that. So then that wouldn't necessarily be a cost either. So it it really depends, but it's around, it could be like 30% of the gross cost would be like the net cost. Um, you kind of calculate it as like a negative income tax too, and say, okay, well, what would the cost of a negative income tax be where the phase out rate is like 40% or 30% or something like that? And then that's an accurate depiction of what the cost of a basic income would be paired with, say, a 30% flat tax or something like that. So in general, the amount that's required for a basic income is much smaller than people think, and tying that in too with the savings from like reduced crime, reduced healthcare expenditures, these kinds of things, then there isn't as much of an impact on consumer demand as people would think, um, that who are worried about inflation. Uh, and again, depending on taxes, and then there's a different amount of inflationary pressure when you're looking at, say, a fully deficit financed basic income versus a fully revenue neutral um, uh, basic income where every dollar is matched by a dollar of taxes. Like, these also have different inflationary pressures. Um, but also another thing to mention is, and this has been observed in experiments too. This was in the India UBI pilot where costs went down, um, and the reason costs went down is because, yes, people had more money, which people who worry about inflation then worry, oh well, that's more money chasing the same amount of goods, and then therefore prices have to go up. But what happened there is that suppliers see that increased demand and they say, oh, well, I want to make money, so I want to meet that demand with supply. And it's entirely possible, again, with the heightened entrepreneurship that we've seen, that you see a greater amount of supply increase than the demand increase. And when you do that, you see lower prices because supply has expanded so much more beyond demand. And you can see that as a potential as well in economies that can easily increase the amount of their goods. Like, let's say their economic capacity is at 60% or something. And so they could be producing more, but they aren't because the demand isn't there. But if you increase the demand, then let's say you go up to 80% of economic capacity, in which case you're still below 100% capacity. You're still able to meet that demand. You just had to crank it up a bit. So I point that out because it is possible that certain goods and services could actually get cheaper as a result of basic income. And certain things that you can't crank up supply would likely be more expensive. So let's say, you're looking at one of a kind of goods, luxury goods, things of limited supply. If you're selling something that there's only 100 of them, then you can't make any more than 100 of them, in which case it could cost more for each one. So that's kind of like a wider look at the inflation question.
Then one thing would interest me in the longer studies, the studies that went for a longer time. Um, did were then some calculations made as to I don't know the proper term? I would say GDP now, but obviously it's just a region, not the whole country. As did that increase dramatically, or were there some what were the differences there? Was there anything calculated?
Yeah. So there's a lot of different calculations for, especially like the multiplier effect. And I would say on average, you're somewhere around $2 per $1, um, depending on the details. And this is true even for stuff other than basic income. Like in the U.S., food stamps can also have an economic multiplier impact of close to $2 per $1. Um, it's just a matter of the nature of putting money in the hands of those with lower incomes, and then how that gets spent more and more and more versus those at the top. So yeah, it's a commonly observed thing, and I would say it's on average around $2 per $1.
Wow, but that's a pretty good return, is it not?
I think so.
Now,
There's also
from
that I would add to I think this is a good example of these multipliers and kind of this wider picture kind of return on investment, is that you could probably look at this. You're talking about I think it's Kindergeld in Germany that provides to kids. We don't have that in the U.S. We only like tested basically it. We did 6 months of the enhanced child tax credit in the second half of 2021, and we it was essentially a basic income for kids because it went to 9 out of 10 kids in the country, and yeah, we saw all these positive impacts. Um, One of the studies of this said that if we were to actually implement this, then we could expect an ROI of $10 per $1. So that's, we spend over $1 trillion per year on the downstream cost of child poverty. Multiple studies have looked at this to calculate what is like the true cost of child poverty, and we calculate it's over $1 trillion per year. And the cost of actually just doing what we did for 6 months was $100 billion per year. So it's crazy to me to look at $100 billion expense and say that's too expensive, and then have no problem spending $1 trillion per year. This 10 to 1 ROI, I think is just insane to say no to. So yeah, I'm curious what Germany has calculated for the economic benefit of Kindergeld when it comes to ROI.
sadly, I don't know that. Uh, Still, what I think we already talked about it, and there was no I don't it was hard to figure out. But I would still be interested in whether why there was no implementation of this UBI for a longer time, or complete integration. Because after this talk, I definitely think, oh, that sounds like a good idea, but maybe I'm not seeing the other side. Um, because I gotta be honest, this sounded really good, but still, there gotta be a reason why it's not implemented yet, right?
Yeah, no, people ask me all the time, Scott, like you say all these positive impacts of UBI, like there's got to be some downsides. And it's just there aren't really these obvious downsides. I consider them to be eye of beholder downsides. And when I say eye of beholder, I mean like there's an example of let's say in it was both Namibia and India, where basically the only people who hated the program, or those who hated basic income most, were moneylenders. And so, you
Oh,
know, if your business is essentially built on the existence of the scarcity of money, then the last thing you want is for people to have more money,
that makes
because
sense.
no one's going to accept your 1,000% interest rate loans that they're desperate and only accept because they're desperate. If you have, you know, this basic income where you could, you know, choose otherwise. And so that to me is a good example of this eye of beholder. Same thing when it comes to, say, an abusive spouse. You know, like if you're an abusive spouse, you see over and over again that basic income reduces domestic abuse because of this power, this heightened ability for women to leave the house, leave these relationships. You know, if you're getting abused and you're completely disempowered, you rely on your partner for your survival, then you're going to continue to accept the abuse. You can't get out of it. You're trapped. But with a basic income, you can escape that. And so, if you're an abusive partner, you're probably not going to like basic income either. And so, you know, there are these negative impacts depending on the person who's actually, you know, looking at it from their perspective. Um, these negative impacts that I would consider, you know, to be kind of like society consensus negative impacts, they aren't there. You know, these all these concerns that people have about these horrible things, like drug abuse is another one. You know, people think, oh well, people will use this to buy drugs and they'll, you know, they'll drink more alcohol and these things. But this is a very what this is a you know there's a lot of evidence behind this finding in particular, which is that you just don't see that when you provide unconditional cash to people. The general impact is that overall, uh, the spending money on alcohol and drugs and these things actually goes down slightly. And you can understand that too from this perspective of, you know, what is this really? You know, if you're abusing drugs, if you're abusing alcohol, a lot of this is self medication. You know, you're living a life that you don't want to be living. You're unhappy. You're stressed out. You're depressed. You know, thanks to impoverishment or chronic stress and insecurity. A lot of that leads to these things. And so, if you suddenly have sufficient income and you suddenly have sufficient security, then you don't look at that in the same way. You don't self medicate as you would previously. And so that's why you see less of that. Um, but people still fear it. You know, people still think, oh, well, it doesn't matter what the evidence says. I think that if people get this, they'll use drugs. And therefore, I'm a good person for making sure that they don't have money to spend. Like, that's what we're fighting.
Now over to the rapid fire questions. Um, Note, some of these might not be related to UBI or your findings, but are more personal.
Sure.
And I would be grateful if you could answer in around about 2 to 3 sentences, so that they're really rapid fire. It's often hard. Let me start off. If you had a big billboard, let's say on Times Square, everybody would see it. What would you put on it?
Uh, I like what Switzerland did, and they actually did do this. This was in Times Square. They they put up the question, what would you do if your income was guaranteed? And so it's yeah, it's just this question of getting people to think. What would a basic income do for me? What are you not doing because you don't have a basic income? Right? People thinking about that, I think, is very strong.
Do you have a favorite quote?
Uh, I have lots of favorite quotes, but
Just
the
name
one that
one.
comes to mind right immediately off the bat is "My religion is to do good."
A controversial opinion. I believe what almost nobody else does.
What is this? This is me having the opposite opinion of what most people have.
Yes, basically. Can you think of something where you what nobody else or most people don't believe in, but you believe in?
I mean, I already feel that basic income actually answers that, but it's too easy. Um, I would just say that, and this ties in with my earlier response that my religion is to do good. I know I'm in the minority when I don't believe in a higher power. I believe that we have a limited existence, and we should do everything we can in the here and now while we're alive, and enjoy it.
What's your newest, biggest insight?
Um, so this is from the newest um, UBI pilot results, and this is just something I learned today, and it's that comparing the 2-year cohort to the 12-year cohort, there was no difference really when it came to work impacts. In which case, the theory that people don't work less in all of these various pilots we've seen only because they only get the money for like a year or two is kind of shot, because if the impact is the same between 2-year and 12-year, then I think we can say that when we see these negligible work impacts in these 2-year groups across the country and the world, um, I think it's an accurate depiction of how people would actually work with a lifelong permanent basic income.
Ooh, that's actually I have to dig right in there. It did in both these cases. Did it not increase the work the work time, the total work time?
It did not decrease the work time.
Okay, hmm. Interesting. Okay. Um, what would you have liked to known when you were 20?
I would have liked to know uh, like more of the details of how politics actually works. like I started voting as soon as I could. I as soon as I was turned 18, I registered and began to vote. Um, but there's just there's just so much like to it. Where back then I thought it was just about voting, and yet there's more about like how we vote, the systems around how we vote, um, the interconnections between like media and politics and money in politics, especially in the U.S. Like it's just a giant mess, and I think it's an it. I think it would be helpful, especially in the US, for there to be more education in school, um, to kind of better appreciate and understand this stuff, so that there's, more of a pride and more engagement, even at a young age, in politics.
Uh, I think one can, or I can call you an activist, and what have you learned over the years? What would advice would you give to someone else who sees a problem in their society and who wants to fix it, who wants to bring awareness to it? What advice can you give?
My advice is to always look at this stuff as a marathon and not a sprint, and to know that no matter how much sense something makes as something, some improvement that you're fighting for, it can be a long time to actually achieve that. And so don't get discouraged that this doesn't like you don't see like these impacts right off the bat. And and also just know that it requires a lot of repetition. you know? Like you need to say the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. Um, and that's just part of it.
How so? Not necessarily related to UBI, but it can be related. You can use this as an answer. But you don't have to. How would you spend $10 billion to make the world a better place?
Yeah, I could certainly put $10 billion to use. Um, First of all, so I'm the founder and president of a nonprofit called Income to Support All Foundation. There are two projects that I really want to get off the ground that are called Commingle and Bootstraps. The total cost to get both those off the ground is around $3 million. So like that would be great for at least a chunk of that to go towards to make sure that these pivotal projects I think could really make a difference are seen by the world. But beyond that, if I were to try to figure out a way to use all of that money, um, I think it would be incredible to somehow utilize that to figure out like a permanent basic income somewhere, like in some location, not like a pilot, where you're not looking at this for like 2 years or whatever, or 12 years even, but you're setting up something that is entirely sustainable, for forever essentially. And so that what would that be like to be able to show like a basic income in action somewhere in like some small country or some like island nation or something like that. I think that would be very powerful.
Do you happen to know Udit Galor? And if you do, what do you think of him?
Who is this?
Udit Galor. He's a professor at I forgot the school now, but he's an Ivy League professor. If you don't, then it's
I don't think I do.
okay. Well, thank you very much for taking the time. I think it was really interesting. And if you want to know more about Scott and his ideas and insight about UBI, get his book, Let There Be Money: Understanding Modern Monetary Theory and Basic Income. Thank you very much, Scott.
Thank you. It was enjoyable.